Once upon a time, in the kingdom of a fickle fae, filled with cold beauty and cruel wonders, a wicked witch was banished to the mortal world for a crime too terrible to name. In her escape, she carried her last and greatest theft, a child not of flesh and blood, but something half-formed, plucked too soon from its cradle in the dark. The boy was soft, like the space between waking and dreaming, and his tiny face was unfinished. But the witch was wise. She knew that the thing she had taken would always yearn for the world it had been torn from, that it would slip through her fingers and return to the cradle of the fae if she did not bind it. To prevent the other world from calling to him, she laid a curse upon his name, and soon it was forgotten. The whimpering child grew twisted under her care, as the dark magic took root in his bones, twisting through marrow and reshaping him in the will of his newfound mother. His limbs stretched and shrank, so they were far too long in some places, but too stubby in others. His fingers blackened like the legs of a spider, and the end of his spine curled inward like the roots of an ancient tree. And his voice, his terrible voice, was the sound of dead leaves scraping over stone. The witch raised him in the dark of her cottage in the woods, where the rafters sagged under the weight of dried herbs and animal pelts, the smells of wormwood and belladonna overwhelming the damp fur and rot. Tangles of bird bones were strung up like wind chimes, and each surface beheld an endless array of bottles, jars, and vials, filled with teeth, hair, and pickling eyeballs. She taught him the old magics, the art of spinning something from nothing, of plucking the world's refuse and weaving it into treasures fit for kings. But nothing lasts forever, and in time, the witch was gone. Whether she had died or met some darker fate, unraveling into the void from which she had come, none could say. And so the twisted thing that was her son wandered alone. Eventually, he stumbled upon a girl locked in a tower, her sobs echoing through the cold stone walls. She sat hunched over a pile of straw, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her fingers, raw and bloody, trembled as they twisted the straw hopelessly, the spinning wheel thrown aside in despair. She was the miller's daughter, bound by her father's reckless promise to the king, a promise made out of desperation to save his family from ruin. The king, intrigued by the outlandish claim that she could spin straw into gold, had brought her to the castle, where he demanded she prove her worth or face the consequences. "Get to work now," the king said. "Spin all night, and if by morning you have not spun this straw into gold, then your father will die for his dishonesty." Then she was locked in the room, all alone, and for her life, she had no idea what to do. For magic was not hers to wield, and so she did the only thing she could. She wept. "Poor little thing," whispered a crackling voice from the shadows, and the girl was startled so the little man that was Rumpelstiltskin unfurled from the shadows like a spider stretching its crooked legs. His joints clanked against themselves as they moved along, and his eyes were large black pits.
"Why are you crying?"
he asked. "Oh," answered the girl, "I am supposed to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it." The little man said,
"What will you give me if I spin it for you?"
She thought for a moment, then placed her blood-stained hand upon the chain at her throat. "My necklace," said the girl. It was a modest thing, nothing more than a simple pendant, but it was a gift from her mother, buried many years ago. The little man took the necklace between his fingers, and it sank into his flesh, swallowed whole. Then he set to work, but not with the spinning wheel, for that was a tale for gentler worlds. The little man reached to his wrist, where the skin parted like the seam of a too-tight glove, and from within he plucked a single thread, long, wet, glistening, impossibly fine. Unspooled, he fed it to the straw, and the straw drank it deep. By dawn, the room was filled with treasure, and the little man, hollow and thin as a husk, disappeared once more to the shadows. When the king saw the gold, he was overjoyed and greatly impressed, but he was not satisfied, for greed is a wretched thing. He wanted more. His Majesty had the miller's daughter taken to another chamber filled with straw, this one grander and taller than the first, filled to the rafters with fodder. He ordered her to spin all the straw to gold by the next morning, if she valued her life or her father's. Then the door was locked behind her. The heavy key turned with an ominous clank. The girl did not know what to do, and she cried and bit her lip until it bled as her hands trembled over the useless spinning wheel. Then once again, the strange man appeared from the shadows. He said,
"What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?"
"The ring from my finger," answered the girl. The man smiled, his teeth too small and too sharp for his mouth, and as tears welled in the young girl's eyes, she tugged the simple band from her finger, her very last relic of her mother's love. She placed it in his palm, and his fingers closed over it, swallowing it whole. Then he reached into his own chest, parting the skin like overripe fruit, and grasped a dewy thread from beneath the flesh and pulled. The raw, bloody fibers twisted into gleaming gold, bleeding light into the dark room as he spun, and by morning, the room was filled with treasure. The king was happy beyond measure when he saw it, but he still did not have his fill. He ordered for the vast and towering ballroom to be filled from floor to ceiling with straw, like the dunes of some terrible desert. Then he took the miller's daughter to it and said, "Tonight you must spin this too. If you succeed, you shall become my wife." As he watched the servants lock the heavy doors, the king laughed to himself. "I will not find a richer wife in all the world, even if she is a miller's daughter." When the girl was alone, the strange man returned for a third time. He said,
"What will you give me this time if I spin the straw into gold?"
"I have nothing more that I could give you," answered the girl.
"What would you give to live another day?"
asked the man.
"Anything,"
she whispered.
"Then promise me," he said,
licking his lips.
"After I make you rich, and you marry the king, and you sit upon a golden throne, your firstborn child will be mine."
The girl, trembling, nodded. Who knows what will happen otherwise, she thought. And certainly, the king would kill her and her father if she failed. So she choked back a sob, and the deal was struck. And in return, the man once again spun the straw into gold. When in the morning the king found everything just as he desired, he married her, and the beautiful miller's daughter became a queen. A year passed, and the queen bore a child, a perfect thing, warm and pink and soft. She thought no more of the creature from the dark. But one night, as the wind howled against the castle walls, she awoke to find him standing at the foot of her bed.
"Now, give me what you promised."
The queen took fright and wept, offering all the riches of the kingdom if he would let her keep the child.
"No," the man said. "Something living is dearer to me than all the treasures of the world."
But in all her crying, he began to feel pity for the girl. So he said,
"I will give you 3 days' time. If by then you know my name, then you shall keep your child."
The queen spent the entire night thinking of all the names she had ever heard. Then she sent a messenger into the country to inquire far and wide what other names had been cursed or forgotten. When the strange little man returned the next day, she guessed Jacob, Wilhelm, and Hansel. And after each one, the man said,
"That is not my name."
The second day, she sent inquiries into the neighborhood as to what names people had. She recited the most unusual and most curious names to the little man. "Is your name Button Bright?" she asked. "Perhaps Bluebeard or Fezziwig?"
"No, no, no," the little man always answered. "That is not my name."
On the third day, the messenger returned and said, "I have not been able to find a single new name, but when I was approaching a high mountain in the corner of the woods, there, where the fox and the hare say goodnight, I saw a little fire burning in front of a little house, and a grotesque little man was jumping about the fire, hopping on one leg and shouting secrets to the trees.
Spin and weave, thread and bone. When debt is sealed, a fate is sown. The child is mine, the pact is set. For who could name me? None have yet. Twist and turn, the deal is made. Yet say my name, and I shall fade. Though tongues may twist, and voices dim, none shall say, Rumpelstiltskin.
When the little man appeared that night, triumphantly grinning, The young girl did not cry, nor did she plead or slouch. She stood tall, and when the man said, "Now, Madam Queen, what is my name?" she first asked, "Is your name Percival?" "No." "Then Augustus?" "No." "Perhaps it could be," she said, pausing with thrill, "Rumpelstiltskin." The man convulsed as if struck, as his lips twisted furiously. "The devil told you that," he cried. "The devil told you." "Rumpelstiltskin," the girl shouted. "Rumpelstiltskin! Rumpelstiltskin! Rumpelstiltskin!" His skin darkened, then split, his fingers curling inward like charred paper. He let out a horrible cry of laughter and agony, and then the fire took him, eating him from the inside out. The room filled with the scent of scorched earth, the air choked with cinders, and then he was gone. The queen held the child to her breast and fled her chambers without looking back. But when the doors of the grand hall flung open, and the people gathered round to welcome their queen and her babe, someone, a nursemaid perhaps, spoke the little boy's name lovingly, and the baby screamed. Before their eyes, one tiny arm blackened and withered, the skin curling away like old parchment, until nothing remained but a stump.
It was the evening of the high school dance, and Catherine was wearing the dress she'd worked on all year. She didn't have the money to buy something new like the other girls in school, but her talented hands created something much better, something one of a kind. The red, sparkling fabric was stunning against her skin, and she knew her crush, Matthew, would simply have to take notice. But after she'd blushed her cheeks and straightened her hair, she was greeted by her mother in the kitchen, wearing a heavy scowl. "You're not going to the dance," she said. "Dancing is for the devil's children, and you dress in the color of sin. Go upstairs at once, change your clothes and wipe your face. Then come down and make us something to eat." Her mother returned to the front of the house, where she was likely reading or sewing, and Catherine stomped up the stairs to her room. She'd told her mother all about the dance, even showing her a glimpse of the fabric the day she brought it home. But sometimes it was like she had two different mothers entirely, and tonight she had the mean one. She dampened a cloth and raised it to her cheek, but paused. It wasn't fair. She'd waited years for this dance and spent hours on her dress. And who knows who Matthew would dance with if she wasn't there? For the first time in her life, she decided to defy her mother. She gathered her things, walked down the stairs and out of the house without saying a word. With a burst of adrenaline, Catherine sprinted towards the school gym. The dance had already started, and she wanted to enjoy every moment possible. She could hear the music from outside as she neared the doors and finally entered the building. In a fantastic moment, it felt like every single person in the room stopped and looked at her standing there in her shimmering dress. She was so used to going unseen. She looked through the crowd for Matthew, but couldn't find him. Her girlfriends were all on the dance floor with their dates, so Catherine stood near the punch bowl as she continued looking around the room for her crush. A few other boys came up to her and asked her to dance, and she bathed in the euphoria of turning them down. After all, she was waiting for someone. Finally, she spotted Matthew with a group of his friends, and their eyes locked. Her breath caught in her throat. But this was the moment she had been waiting for. His eyes remained on her as she made her way in his direction. She could tell he was shocked by the beauty of her dress. But when she asked him to dance, he turned the color of the fabric. The others around him laughed, teasing him for being asked to dance by a girl. Catherine stepped to the shadows of the gym, suddenly regretting the choices that led here. She'd never admit it, but she'd made the dress for him. Now it was for nothing, and she couldn't bear to think of what punishment awaited at home. From the darkness of the crowd, a gorgeous young man appeared next to her. She'd never seen him before. He had shiny jet black hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and piercing eyes that captivated. And he turned to Catherine and asked her to dance. She couldn't even manage to say yes. She only held out her hand for the taking. He led her to the dance floor, and the music suddenly erupted in volume. They danced together, and she moved with an ease she didn't recognize. She'd always loved to dance, but never had much talent for it. She followed the beautiful man's lead, very aware of the hundreds of eyes on them. The man spun her around and around. The others in the gym clapped and cheered, and he spun her faster. She began to lose her breath and tried to step out of the spin, but he spun her even faster. The floor seemed to melt beneath her feet. She tried to focus on her own limbs but couldn't. It was as if they moved on their own accord, and her feet grew hotter and hotter, and yet he spun her faster. The crowd cheered and whooped and applauded, and finally she was spinning so fast that a cloud of dust formed around them so thick that they could no longer be seen by the crowd. The music returned to its normal level, and the dust fell to the floor, revealing the beautiful man standing there. But Catherine nowhere to be seen. He took a bow for the crowd, and, fully enamored, they applauded with vigor. And then he disappeared too. The devil had come for one of his children and spun her all the way to hell.
Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check!" "I should hardly think he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog, the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife, soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples.
21 years of it,
said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son.
When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him.
He don't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White, politely.
I like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look round a bit, you know. Better where you are,
said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again.
I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?
Nothing, said the soldier hastily.
Leastways, nothing worth hearing.
Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White, curiously.
Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps,
said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him.
To look at,
said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket.
It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously.
And what is there special about it?
Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it upon the table.
It had a spell put on it by an old fakir,
said the sergeant major.
A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it.
His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat.
Well, why don't you have 3, sir?
Said Herbert White, cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth.
I have,
he said, quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White.
I did,
said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady.
The first man had his 3 wishes.
Yes, was the reply.
I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw.
His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group.
If you had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris,
said the old man at last.
What do you keep it for?
The soldier shook his head.
Fancy, I suppose,
he said slowly.
I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes,
said the old man, eyeing him keenly,
would you have them? I don't know,
said the other.
I don't know.
He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off.
Better let it burn,
said the soldier, solemnly.
If you don't want it, Morris,
said the other,
give it to me.
I won't, said his friend doggedly.
I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely.
How do you do it?
He inquired.
Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud,
said the sergeant major.
But I warn you of the consequences.
Sounds like the Arabian Nights,
said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper.
Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm.
"If you must wish,"
he said gruffly,
"wish for something sensible."
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India.
"If the tale of the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us,"
said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train,
"we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, Father?"
inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely.
"A trifle,"
said he, coloring slightly.
"He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away."
"Likely,"
said Herbert, with pretended horror.
"Why, we're going to be rich, and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked."
He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously.
"I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact,"
he said slowly.
"It seems to me I've got all I want."
"If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?"
said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder.
"Well, wish for £200 then, that'll just do it."
His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords.
"I wish for £200,
said the old man, distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him.
"It moved,"
he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor.
"As I wished. It twisted in my hand like a snake."
"Well, I don't see the money," said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table. "And I bet we never shall."
"It must have been your fancy, Father,"
said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head.
"Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same."
They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night.
"I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed,"
said Herbert as he bade them good night.
"And something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains."
He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues.
"I suppose all old soldiers are the same,"
said Mrs. White.
"The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, Father?"
"Might drop on his head from the sky,"
said the frivolous Herbert.
"Morris said the things happen naturally,"
said his father.
"That you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence."
"Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table.
"I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you."
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road. and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill.
"Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner.
I dare say,
said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer.
but for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to.
"You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly.
I say it did,
replied the other.
There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well-dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent.
I was asked to call,
he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers.
I come from Moore and Meggins.
The old lady started.
"Is anything the matter?"
she asked breathlessly.
"Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?"
Her husband interposed.
There, Mother,
he said hastily.
Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
And he eyed the other wistfully.
I'm sorry,
began the visitor.
Is he hurt? Is he hurt?
Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent.
Badly hurt,
he said quietly.
But he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God,
said the old woman, clasping her hands.
Thank God for that.
She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's perverted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery,
said the visitor at length in a low voice.
Caught in the machinery,
repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us,
he said, turning gently to the visitor.
It is hard.
The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window.
The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking round. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant, and merely obeying orders.
There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action.
I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation.
Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that, the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back,
he said tenderly.
You will be cold.
It is colder for my son,
said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start.
"The paw!"
she cried wildly.
"The monkey's paw!"
He started up in alarm.
Where? Where is it? What's the matter?
She came stumbling across the room toward him.
"I want it,"
she said quietly.
"You've not destroyed it."
It's in the parlor, on the bracket,
he replied, marveling.
Why?
She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek.
"I only just thought of it,"
she said hysterically.
"Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?"
Think of what?
He questioned.
"The other 2 wishes,"
she replied rapidly.
"We've only had 1.
Was that not enough?
He demanded fiercely.
"No,"
she cried triumphantly.
"We'll have 1 more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again."
The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs.
Good God, you are mad!
He cried, aghast.
"Get it,"
she panted.
"Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy."
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed,
he said unsteadily.
You don't know what you're saying.
"We had the first wish granted,"
said the old woman feverishly.
"Why not the second?"
A coincidence,
stammered the old man.
"Go and get it and wish,"
cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook.
He's been dead 10 days. And besides, I will not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see, then how now?
"Bring him back,"
cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door.
"Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?"
He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table, and groped along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
"Wish!"
she cried in a strong voice.
It is foolish and wicked,
he faltered.
"Wish!"
repeated his wife. He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
Cried the old woman, starting up.
A rat,
Said the old man in shaking tones.
a rat. It passed me on the stairs.
His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house.
It's Herbert! She screamed. It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly.
What are you going to do?
He whispered hoarsely.
It's my boy! It's Herbert!
She cried, struggling mechanically.
I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door!
For God's sake, don't let it in!
Cried the old man, trembling.
You're afraid of your own son,
She cried, struggling.
Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!
There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting.
The bolt!
She cried loudly.
Come down! I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
A long time ago, there lived a skillful scientist who had experienced a spiritual reaction more striking than any chemical one. He had left his laboratory in the care of his assistant, washed the chemicals away from his hands, and asked a beautiful woman to become his wife. In those days, new scientific discoveries, such as electricity, seemed to open paths into areas of miracles. It was not unusual for the love of science to compete with the love of a woman. The scientist's name was Almer. He had so totally given himself to scientific studies that he could not be weakened by a second love. His love of his young wife could only be the stronger of the two if it could link itself with his love of science. Such a union did take place with truly remarkable results. But one day, very soon after their marriage, Aylmer looked at his wife with a troubled expression. In the center of Georgiana's left cheek was a mark, deep in her skin. The mark was usually a deep red color. When Georgiana blushed, the mark became less visible. But when she turned pale, there was the mark, like a red stain upon the snow. The birthmark, shaped vaguely like a small human hand, would come and go with the emotions in her heart. Past lovers would say that the hand of a magical fairy had touched her face as a child. Many men would have risked their lives for the honor of kissing that mysterious hand, but other people had different opinions. Some women said the red hand destroyed the effect of Georgiana's beauty. Some men, who did not favor the mark, simply wished it away so they did not see it. After his marriage, Aylmer discovered that this was the case with himself. Had Georgiana been less beautiful, he might have felt his love increased by the prettiness of that little hand. But because she was otherwise so perfect, he found the mark all the more repulsive. Aylmer saw the mark as a sign of his wife's eventual sadness, sickness, and death. Soon, the birthmark caused him more pain than Georgiana's beauty had ever given him pleasure.
Georgiana,
He said.
have you ever considered the mark upon your cheek might be removed?
No, she said, smiling. But seeing the seriousness of his question, she said, the mark has so often been called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so.
On another face it might, but not on yours. No, dear, nature made you so perfectly that this small defect shocks me as being a sign of earthly imperfection.
Shocks you? Cried Georgiana, deeply hurt. Her face reddened and she burst into tears. Then how could you marry me? How could you love what shocks you? During a period that should have been their happiest, Aylmer could only think of this disastrous subject. With the morning light, Aylmer opened his eyes upon his wife's face and recognized the sign of imperfection. When they sat together in the evening near the fire, he would look at the mark. Georgiana soon began to fear his look. His expression would make her face go pale, and the birthmark would stand out like a red jewel on white stone. "Do you remember, dear Aylmer?" she asked with a weak smile. "About the dream you had last night? About this hateful mark?" He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, the memory of his dream returning. He had imagined himself with his assistant trying to remove the birthmark with an operation. But the deeper his knife went, the deeper the small hand sank until it had caught hold of Georgiana's heart. Aylmer felt guilty remembering the dream. "Aylmer," pleaded Georgiana, "we do not know what the cost could be, to both of us, to remove this birthmark. I fear being left deformed, or with damage to my health."
Dearest Georgiana, I have spent much thought on the subject. I am sure it can be removed.
Georgiana exhaled, looking away. "Life is not worth living while this mark makes me the object of your horror. You are deeply knowledgeable and have made great discoveries. Please, Aylmer, remove this mark for the sake of your peace and my own."
Dearest wife,
He deliberately kissed her unblemished cheek.
I am ready to make this cheek as perfect as its other half.
The next day, the couple went to Aylmer's laboratory, where he had prepared a beautiful room for his wife. Though he had previously made several famous discoveries, Aylmer's series of powerful experiments failed, one by one. the mark remained. Georgiana waited in her room, reading through his notebooks of experiments and observations. She could not help but notice that many of his experiments had ended in failure. She decided to see for herself the scientist at work. The first thing that struck Georgiana when she entered the laboratory was the hot furnace. From the amount of soot above it, it seemed to have been burning for ages. She saw machines, tubes, cylinders, and other containers for chemical experiments. What most drew her attention was Almer himself. He was nervous and pale as death as he prepared a liquid. Georgiana realized that her husband had been hiding his tension and fear.
You think so little of me that you couldn't be honest about the risks we are taking?
My dear, nothing shall be hidden. I have already given you chemicals powerful enough to change your entire physical system.
I will drink whatever you give me, even if it's a poison.
My dear, you've got just one thing left to try. If it fails, we are ruined.
He led her back to her room where she waited once more alone with her thoughts. She hoped that for just one moment she could satisfy her husband's highest ideals, but she realized then that his mind would forever be on the march, always requiring something newer, better, and more perfect. Hours later, Alma returned, carrying a crystal glass with colorless liquid.
The chemical process went perfectly. Unless all my science has tricked me, it cannot fail.
To test the liquid, he placed a drop in the soil of a dying flower growing in a pot. In a few moments, the plant danced back to life, becoming healthy and green once more.
Give me the glass, Georgiana said quietly. I do not need proof.
She drank the liquid and immediately fell asleep. Almer sat next to his wife, observing her and taking notes. He noted everything, her breathing, the movement of an eyelid. He stared at the birthmark, and slowly, with every breath that came and went, it lost some of its brightness.
By heaven, it is nearly gone.
He opened the window coverings to see her face in daylight. She was so pale. Georgiana opened her eyes and looked into the mirror her husband held. She tried to smile as she saw a barely visible birthmark.
My dear, success.
My poor Almer,
she said, gently.
So high and pure a feeling. You have rejected the best the earth could offer.
As the last trace of color disappeared from her cheek, she gave her last breath. His eyes rested on her barren, snow-colored cheek. She was so alluring, even in death. Yet, without the rosy hand embellishing her face, her commanding beauty was no more, leaving behind an average facade unworthy of note. A plain face could so quickly be forgotten. In trying to improve his lovely wife, he had failed to realize that she had been perfect all along.